Everyone, and a very warm welcome to this very special Friday webinar here. So today, of course, special occasion because we have our friend and colleague, Associate Professor Kevin Tolhurst address us this morning. So why is it a special occasion? I'm not quite sure, but someone told me it might be his last presentation here in a certain capacity. But we'll talk about that more after the seminar. We first want to listen to him and see whether he's any good.
It's a job application.
So let me introduce Kevin very briefly. Kevin has been here with us since the 70s. Kept pretty well. So he was a student here, and he did a Bachelor of Forest Science here at Creswick. And all along, he also was at the same time with the Forest Commission in various roles as a forest assessor, a forest researcher, a forest officer, everything to do with forests. So he did his degree here with us, and he finally graduated in '79. Is that correct? You correct me if I'm wrong. They actually gave me a giant pack here of Kevin's CV, and I only have a very few pages that I took here because otherwise there wouldn't be any time for you, Kevin, to do your presentation. So he then worked again with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and many different names over the years, as you know, where he was a team leader for fire effects research. In the 90s, he was a principal scientist, fire research and development with the Department of Natural Resources and Environment, same department, different name. He was then in the late 90s a lecturer and a researcher for fire ecology and management, senior lecturer from 2001 to 2011, again fire ecology and management, and he became an associate professor soon after, again in fire ecology and management. Kevin, as you know, is also multi-award winning, and I can't mention all the awards here, but most recently, he got the International Association of Wildland Fire's Amber Award for Excellence in Wildland Fire Science. He's a member of the Order of Australia, an honor that he received very well earned in 2015. And the list goes on. The list just keeps on going. It's really an amazing career. Most importantly, Kevin has been a wonderful colleague and friend for many of us for many years. And I will say a few more words after he's done, and then we can comment on the work he's done a bit more. So without further ado, Associate Professor Dr. Kevin Tolhurst.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Gerd, and thanks everyone for coming along today to be instructed, I suppose, by me. I guess I've taken this opportunity to reflect a little bit on where we've come from in bushfire science and sort of look where we're going to. As Gerd said, say a little bit more about some personal things, I guess, after the seminar. But I think there are some key messages that we need to cotton onto and we struggle with at the moment. So I've chosen the Triple Helix that the Melbourne University used as part of their strategy and combine that with bushfire science, and hopefully it all makes some sense by the time I get to the end. One of the things that I have trouble with is often people talk about science in various ways. So long as it's science-based or evidence-based decision-making, science is such a widely used word without really much meaning often. But I've got a picture up here of Sir Francis Bacon because he was probably one of the first people to use the word science back in the 16th century. This is all true because it comes from Wikipedia, you notice. But one of the best definitions I like is this one, which is science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of structure and behaviour of physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Now, I don't think that quite captures it either, but I think we'll get there in the end. But science is often misused, I think, in a sense of a justification for why we do things. So this is another way of looking at science as a systematic enterprise that builds and organises knowledge. in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. Now, the prediction thing I think is quite important. So while studying at Melbourne Uni in the botany school, I did pathology, and one of the things you come up with there is Koch's postulate. Now, there are some problems with Koch's postulate, but at the same time, I think it's quite good because you're looking at a diseased organism. What you've got to say is, well, what are all the potential organisms that could be causing that disease? You isolate all of those. You then try to reinfect a healthy organism with perhaps the bacteria or the fungi that you're looking at, and see if you can get the same result. And if you can, you've got to isolate again from that reinfected organism that the causal agent. And so you have to go through this proof process. Now, that's in a pathological sort of sense, but I think a lot of our science, when it comes to things like bushfire behaviour, for example, being able to predict the fire, putting that into a simulation model, for example, I think is a really useful way of understanding how well we actually understand the underlying science and connections there. So modelling, I think, has a really important role to test how well our science works. And why I say that is that we spend a lot of time dealing with the minutiae of systems, and that's part of science, but I don't think it's the strength of science, and I'll go through that. So sometimes just the body of knowledge is considered to be science, but I don't think that really hits the mark. And Rosemary, my wife, says it's just how stuff works. So I think that captures it probably best of all, in a sense. If you understand how stuff works, then that's a pretty major advance. You might think you know how stuff works, that's different. It's when you really know how it works that you're actually starting to get to the base of it. All right, so that's even a more reliable source than Wikipedia if you're sort of looking for future references. So I often use that Rosemary source. So when we come to looking at science, often we go down a line of what can be called reductionism. And I would contrast that with complexity. So reductionism is what we're quite used to, where we control a whole lot of influencing factors, except those that we deliberately manipulate in an experimental environment. And we do these sort of experiments to find out how individual factors might be influencing a result. And in sort of programming terms, it's sort of the if-then-else type scenario. So if this is the case, then this will be the outcome. And if that's not the outcome, then there'll be some other alternative outcome. So if we understand the system. And I remember from a long time ago, someone sort of said to me when I was talking about doing a PhD that that's to know more and more about less and less until you know absolutely everything about nothing. So that's I guess the extension of reductionism in a sense. You keep narrowing down the field so small so that you can understand it, that it almost becomes nonsensical because it's got no context anymore. So there's value in doing this reduction type approach, but it then has to be put back into a context. So I see this as a sequence of a link in the chain. So the logic has to follow through, and every link has to carry its weight. And if you break one of those links, the logic falls apart. Now, this analogy of the chain, I guess I got from a QC doing some work on the Wangari fire in South Australia. And he said, this is how you sort of put evidence together. He said that the chain approach, the analogy of the chain, is a very weak approach. It seems strong, but you only need one link to break to be a problem. However, most of the systems we deal with, whether it's fire, whether it's the environment, whether it's social communities, are complex systems. And so complexity is the process we really need to go about. So complexity I've defined here is the property of a system which is determined more by the relationships between the elements than the properties of the elements themselves. But we spend so much time with monitoring methods and satellites and ground-based LiDAR and all sorts of things, quantifying the elements themselves. But really what matters more are the relationships between them. And this is where something like a simulation model, again, it's the relationships that you're really defining in your model rather than the fuel or the terrain or the houses or the structures. They have an importance, but it's nowhere near as important as a relationship. If you work out the University of Melbourne, it's not about the size of the buildings and the campuses and all the rest of it. It's really how well people connect and relate to each other. That's where the knowledge gets transferred. It's not because you've got some great lecture theatres with good IT setups. So in old ecological texts, and I think Krebs was a guy that came up with this, divided ecology into form, function and behaviour. And form was the way in which a lot of old ecological work was done. We had what we call descriptive ecology. You go out and describe how a mountain ash forest looked different to a mallee shrubland. So we had this descriptive ecology, and you could learn a lot just purely from observation. But then you would get people making lots of leaps of faith, I guess, of how those systems came about. Function is an area that I guess we've done a lot of work on. We try to understand metabolic processes. We try to understand life cycle processes. We look at nutrient cycling. We look at hydrological cycles. We try to look at processes, and that's sort of the functioning process. However, the key to all of the systems that we're really most interested in is the behaviour. Again, it's the interaction between the individual elements. We do need to know about the form. We do need to know about the function, but the key that we need to unlock the mysteries of all these complex systems is the behaviour. What are the properties of this system that we're dealing with? So when we're dealing, and I would make the analogy here that it's more like a rope. And if we look at the rope here, we see it's made up of multiple strands tangled together. So this multiple strands means that the strength is not reliant on any single strand, but the combination of those strands. And if you're to look more closely, you see there's the rope, then there's the bundles of strands together, and then there's the individual strands, and within that there's smaller strands. But those strands themselves are not smooth and entire and totally isolated. They've actually got rough edges. A lot of the strength of the rope comes from the roughness of those individual strands because they're connecting, cross-connecting with the other strands that they're associated with. So the rope in its entirety has a particular strength, and that's the most important thing you're interested in, far less concerned about, I guess, what individual strands are doing. But in a reductionist approach, we spend a lot of time investigating individual strands without seeing how it fits within the rest of the rope. So in complex systems, we need to be looking for some different things, so behavioural properties. So this idea of emergence. So once we see the system operating, rather than just describing what we see, we want to see what are some of these emergent properties. So the appearance of large-scale properties in self-organising systems. And ecosystem resilience is an area that's been in focus for quite a while. That is an emergent property from an ecosystem. It's not about what EVCs exist there, what plants, what animals exist. It's really about how it's functioning. So we need to be clear that that's what we're looking at. So we can't just use descriptive ways of understanding emergent properties. There's this property also of diffusion limited aggregation, where we get patterns formed where there's natural aggregation going on, but that aggregation has to diffuse through a matrix or a medium that it exists in to develop those clusters. So if we're looking at a population of a bird or a mammal, for example, that population has to exist within habitat that may be scattered across the landscape, but the ideal habitat may be interspersed with swamps, may be interspersed with roads, may be interspersed with cropland. The ability for exchange and movement through that landscape is as important as the habitat that it's living in, and yet we rarely pay much attention to that. The other thing is that the properties of these systems are nearly always non-linear. So what that means is that a small change in the input can mean either a very large or a very little change in the output. They're non-linear systems. And being non-linear, you basically can end up with a chaotic system. So this interaction between the inputs and the outputs, if you like, if you want to put it in those terms, is not linear, and therefore we shouldn't expect a very easy relationship between inputs and outputs. And a lot of the systems are chaotic, a lot of our environmental systems, which basically means that they travel through many states without returning to the starting point. So if we look at an area of land, a patch of bush, if you like, in the landscape, and we burn it, we shouldn't expect it to necessarily come back to exactly where it was when we started, because the environment's different. The time since the last fire, the time since the glacial age has changed. All sorts of things that have an influence have changed. So we shouldn't expect it to necessarily return to the same position, but we're still expecting to have the same emergent properties. We're still expecting it to behave in a particular way. So it's behaviour rather than its physical nature it's really quite important. So we're talking about describing the connectedness, how that connectedness has these properties, tipping points or threshold behaviours that lead to cascades, lead to catastrophes, lead to epidemics, where you move along, perhaps changing the inputs a certain amount with very little change, but then you hit a tipping point or a threshold where another small change will tip it over a particular threshold, and you move into quite a different system. It's part of the concept behind resilience, but it's also a fundamental property of complex systems. So what we're interested in is more about rules or relationships rather than states. So it's about behaviour, not about form. And we're more interested in patterns than we are about points. And yet, you know, we get a laser, you know, an aeroplane or a satellite, and we're just so happy with ourselves that we can describe exactly what's there in great detail in a way that doesn't matter as much as, well, how does that relate to the point beside it? So we need to be clear about where we're going with all of this. So I see Melbourne University's strategy of the Triple Helix having this complex notion acknowledged in a sense. So the three strands of the helix here are teaching, research and engagement. And the university describes what they see each of those characteristics being. Teaching obviously is that transfer of knowledge, and I guess the way the university puts it, it's not only the transfer of knowledge, but then that leading to meaningful careers and profound contributions to society. So they're expecting that transfer of knowledge doesn't stop there, but actually manifests itself then in some greater outcome. The research obviously is the development of that knowledge, but the research, it says here again, being innovative, inspiring, and addresses major social, economic, and environmental challenges of our time. So it's carefully thought research in terms of the direction you're going, but links obviously back to teaching, because the subject matter of your teaching needs to be based on the best available knowledge, which is coming from research, past research as well as present research. And then engagement is a strand that pulls it all together. And what we're saying is that we want to get the best value for our knowledge and our teaching. So how can we measure that, manifest in our society or in our world that we're dealing with? So enriching our teaching and research and deepening the contribution to wider society, that's the strand that the university has the greatest struggle with quantifying, because it is more complex and yet it's probably the most important outcome of the university. The university operates as a business, and from that point of view you can look at the budget line. Are we making a profit? We're making a loss. However, the university, lots of things can be businesses. The university's primary objective, I believe, is in this Triple Helix approach to teaching, research and engaging with the community. So the question is, I guess, when we're looking at something like the Triple Helix, is it more like this chain sequence, or is it more like the rope? So I think we need to understand the properties of this. So I want to conduct a little experiment here. So I've set up a little gizmo over here. People that aren't here are going to miss out on all this excitement. But basically what we've got is a structure over here with a cross arm, and hanging off the arm is a weight held by a chain, and there's also a weight held by a piece of rope. Now, Rick's not here because he didn't want to see the outcome of all of this, so I hope you're listening, Rick. But I've done a risk assessment and I've decided it's way too dangerous for me to do, so I've got my beautiful assistant. So, so I'll just take my precautions and hand over the bolt cutters to Brett. So, Brett, would you try cutting the chain on the on this side here with the bolt cutters, please? Up to the top, yeah. There we go. Okay, we only cut one link, but that was enough to break that linkage. And so the chain is relatively vulnerable in that sense. Would you like to have a go with the rope? Go on, try harder. All right, so the point is, thanks, Brett, you can relax now. It's all right, Rick, no one was hurt. So what we're looking at in the rope scenario was that it was much harder to break that link because there were so many strands. So we broke a few strands the first time we cut it, but he had to persist cutting a number of times to get through all the strands. It's a much stronger way of connecting or understanding a system. So it's that interconnectedness that's really quite important. So in fire management, and some of you will have seen parts of this at the Fire and Fuel Conference, but in a fire management system, I consider there are probably 5 instead of just 3 coils. There are probably 5 pillars we can think of, and I call them research, development, application, experience, and evaluation. And under research, I'm saying, well, that's the captured knowledge and the understanding. That's what research is there for. Development is the technology and the tools that allow you to basically use that knowledge. And education is the transfer process. Application is the policy, the planning and the operations, where we actually see if it works. Then we need, combined with that application, certain amount of skill and knowledge and capability, which I call experience here. So I think that's important as well. And then we need to have some monitoring review to make sure that it's achieving what we expected. That's our test in the Cox postulate in a sense. Can we repeatedly get the outcome that we expect? Do we understand the system well enough to be able to make more decisions about it? So this is the ideal state that I see, where we've got these pillars are all of equal strength and equal height, and we're sitting pretty up the top there with the system. But those pillars don't stand alone. They're actually interlinked, like the fibres in a rope. And so we shouldn't be trying to isolate research from the people who are doing the policy development, from the people doing the monitoring. They shouldn't be all isolated bubbles or strands. They need to actually be interlinked if they're going to work properly. Otherwise, there's very little strength in the system. So, you know, we want to get this strongly cross-adhering rope. We can see this as an ongoing process with some feedback going into the process. So let's see how we've gone. I'll do a bit of an assessment of where I think we are with fire. So about 40,000 years ago, we've had, for about 40,000 years, we've had the Aboriginal people using fire in the landscape. Very deliberate use of fire. They've had some specific objectives to meet, mainly about food and warmth and protection. And they've used fire in the landscape to provide those resources that they sort of need. So they've worked with the landscape and they've understood how fire reacts with the landscape. Bill Gamage has sort of summarised some of this in his book, which gives quite a good insight into, I guess, some of the Aboriginal philosophies. There's been a lot written about Aborigines, but overall, you'd have to say Aborigines were quite skilled users of fire. So this is a diagram how fire is understood by some of the Aboriginals in the Gulf country up in the Carpentaria, Gulf of Carpentaria. And what we see here is the interaction. This is the rope. This is where we've got, in the centre, we're talking about wet and dry season. Yeah, we can cope with that. That's a meteorological sort of factor. Then outside that, we've got calendar months. Yeah, we can work that out. But what's more important, that's a bit of a starting point. What's more important is what's happening at different times of the year. So we'll see here things like wattle tree flowering, dugong mating. Over here, the morning glory cloud formations. Freshwater crocodiles are nesting. We're looking at other factors in the landscape which are actually telling us how this environment is behaving. And it'll behave differently in a drought year compared with a wet year. It'll behave differently after a major fire compared with not having a major fire. The behaviour of this system is interlinked. That's what this diagram is showing us. So on the outer edge here, I notice Barramundi fishing gets quite a pronounced thing. But we've got the early season cool burns, and around here we've got the storm burning, so the late season hot fires. But it's interlinked with key triggers or indicators from the natural environment. It's not based on the 20th of September is when we do something, or it's not because we do it in spring. It's linked with other biological, environmental triggers or indicators. So that's what the Aboriginal people are doing. So, but if you were to assess it on my 5-pillar example here, you'd see they certainly were applying fire freely. They had a lot of experience, knowledge and capability, and they were continually monitoring and review because their life depended on it. But they weren't so good necessarily in the research and development area in the sense that we understand it. So they were doing all right, but part of what they did to replace the fact they didn't have that research and development as we see it today is they had their culture, they had their stories, they set up totems, which are really very precious stories about how the system works. So individuals were entrusted with certain totems, and it was their responsibility to perhaps look after that totem. The totem may have been a plant, it may have been an animal, but they had a responsibility and they had a storyline that allowed them to understand how that worked, and that was based on experience. So that's how the knowledge was captured and built up over long periods of time in a different way to what we would do it. So it was in fact quite a stable system. Then I guess going back to European settlement, we came along and we had people with funny hats and clothing sort of come along, and they had a bit of a use of fire. An image here with a bit of smoke coming up from Sydney Cove, but the fire was mainly used for cooking and warmth and maybe getting rid of a bit of rubbish. Pretty limited use of fire in the landscape. So we went from the Aboriginal state, say 10,000 years ago, to where we were with the first European settlers. They really knew next to nothing about fire and made very little use of fire. Really quite low on this the scale here, is the way I see it. However, fire was thrust upon them in a sense. So with lightning-caused fires or fires that escaped from camps and so on, fires started burning through the landscape. So in the next period of time, there was a learning from these new settlers about fire in the landscape and how it evolved. Cattlemen decided that, hey, you get good green pick, high protein grass comes up after fires, so we can use that. So we'll start burning the landscape to improve the productivity of the site. The Aborigines had known that for about 40,000 years, but we learnt it eventually. So up to the 1950s, we were starting to learn a little bit about fire, but more because it was being thrust upon us rather than our deliberate process of understanding and learning. So the cattlemen were probably the main users of fire in a deliberate fashion, in a somewhat analogous way to the way the Aborigines been using fire, but obviously with introduced animals. Then along came the 1939 fires, and it was probably the first real systematic assessment of how fire fitted into our society and into the landscape. So Judge Leonard Stretton wrote this very erudite report, which is still good reading today. But he sort of looked at controlled burning, the deliberate use of fire in the landscape, and he was quite scathing. So in this paragraph here, he says, well, we've got these foresters out in the field, and all they want to do is grow trees, and anything that damages a tree is bad, including fire. So the way he described it was the amount of burning which was done was ridiculously inadequate. And you have to try to understand what's the context of ridiculously inadequate. Inadequate for what? But it was for basically down the bottom here for protection of human life and property, for protection of the landscape, and basically reducing the size of large wildfires. So Stretton saw that fire wasn't being well managed in the landscape and there needed to be some change. So we were fortunate in a sense to have another bad wildfire season in 1944. Stretton said, why haven't you taken notice of what I said in 1939? And so there was a kick along, and there was some changes that sort of took place after the 1944 fires, and 1945 is when the CFA was set up, basically. But we still were basically using fire as a tool, so for land clearing and for just our direct use, but not really for land management. So if we go from the 1880s to the 1950s, I would see that we've had a bit of experience of fire. We're understanding a little more about its utility, but we're still pretty low down, I think, on the scale of where we needed to be. So following 1950, there was an era of fire research. And I guess the linchpin in all this was Alan MacArthur. And some of the things he wrote are still very valid, and we still don't fully understand these days the insights that Alan MacArthur, he understood fire. This was a mapping of a fire, so this is a mapping of a fire from the Dalesford area that was done by, as part of a research program. And Alan sort of looked at this after he came up with a guide for how fires work, and said, well, I've come up with a guide, but it doesn't really work very well where you compare it with a real fire. So this was some work by Athol Hodson from a fire in 1962. But one of the things that Athol had picked out was he mapped where spot fires were occurring. And here's a dynamic feedback process that's going on. And Alan MacArthur saw this and said, this is the bit that's missing from my model, and didn't say how to solve it, but he just said, this is the bit that's missing from my model. It's how this dynamic process of spotting is going on. He said his model underestimated the spread of fire by about a factor of 3, and that's because of the spotting process. It was too hard for him to do that. So that's something that I guess we've been working on in recent times, and something we've captured in Phoenix. So the 1950s, 60s were a bit of a golden time, I guess, for fire research. So we had these scientific reports based on good scientific methods sort of published. So 1962 here, one by Alan MacArthur. That work was continued on in Western Australia by George Peat and others. So we started to take a more scientific approach to looking at fire. So from the 1950s to the 1980s, a massive increase in our understanding. And it wasn't just the researchers that were getting more knowledge, they were actually working with the field people. And so we had this cross-linking going on. So it wasn't the researchers just doing the work, the researchers were doing it in conjunction with the field operators. And the field operators could see what was coming out of this process, and they were able to apply it immediately. So we had a lot of foresters and land managers who could see what the research was coming out. The research would give good direction as to what the more cause and effect relationship was, but it got implemented immediately. So that was a major increase in our use of fires, 1980s. And then if we sort of look at what's happened since the 1980s, I suppose, I've done this very detailed scientific study looking at a Google Scholar search of how many publications there have been on a decadal basis, although this last category is only for 5 years. What you can see is this exponential growth in the number of publications that have come out when you search for wildfire and Australia. So the Bushfire CRC and has really revitalised, I guess, the amount of research that's going on. And what we see here is a lot of research activity coming out. So the question is that manifesting itself in much better land management as well? And if you haven't twigged already, there's no data behind any of this. This is my opinion, all right? All right, but I've got it in graphs because that makes it look as though it's scientific, all right? So I think what we're seeing really is an increase in the amount of research. We've certainly got more technology, more tools. We've probably got a more sophisticated planning and policy framework to work within. And we're doing more monitoring and review than we've done before. But I would contend that our experience, our skill and knowledge has probably dropped below where it ought to be, because there's been a bit of a disconnect between the research and development and the operations and the policy. So we're turning these more into bubbles rather than strands of the same rope. So I think there's some of the evaluation's been thrust upon us with inquiries, so coronial inquiries or royal commissions or parliamentary inquiries. That's forced our hand to understand some of these situations a bit better. And I would say that we've had a bit of a starry-eyed look at tool development to some extent. So we get besotted, I guess, when we've got a new LiDAR or we've got a new radio controlled something or other. The technology boom has fogged our glasses to some extent, and we start to focus too much on the tool rather than what it's capable of doing for us. And we also see the tool as a cheaper way of replacing the skills and the knowledge in this experience category that I've got here. So we say, well, people don't need to know so much about fire because we can give them an app that will help make the decision for them. Well, I'm not sure that works when you're dealing with complex systems. So the tools, in effect, I think have been a bit of a barrier or an impediment to perhaps some of the skill development. And we've just, the way our society works, people change jobs frequently, they move on, and so a lot of skill and built up knowledge is moved on. So the problem that we have is the elements of the fire management process aren't interchangeable. You can't replace experience with tools. We're currently going through a bit of a golden age of fire science in terms of the amount of research that's being done. And as I say, in Australia, the Bushfire CRC and the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC has played a big role in that. Sustainable fire management requires all elements of the process to be equally advanced and to be efficient. And the resources or attention given to one element of the process may well be at the expense of another element. So there's some of the issues or problems we've got. So when we're dealing with fire management, it's a wicked problem. It's complex. There are a lot of factors that go into determining fire management. And we need to be thinking about it in terms of networks, ecosystems, episodic events, catastrophes, extinction. They're really not terms or ways of thinking that we use a lot at the moment. So fires are temporally and spatially variable. And the term fire regime I find problematic because it makes it sound like it's regular and routine. There's nothing regular and routine about fire in the landscape. We can talk about a fire environment, and this graphic depiction from the Gulf of Carpentaria, I think, tells you more about the fire environment because you see the interactions of the different elements that are going on there. So when we're talking about the environment, we're looking at the patterns that can be seen at a landscape level over ecological timescales, not planning timescales. And it will never be fixed in time or space, so we shouldn't expect it to be. So we've got to be really careful when doing mapping processes. So patchiness is really important. That's sort of the nature of the heterogeneity in the landscape. The size of those patches and the proportion of the landscape in each area, the connectedness between those patches and across the landscape, the diffusion, dispersal processes are really important. So the frequency, season, intensity and type distributions are all important. It's about that broader environment. And I don't think we're there with the work that we're doing. We've got the building blocks of some of this, but we need to change our paradigm, I think. So where do I think we're at with fire science at the moment? So I'll try and round off with this. So in terms of fire behaviour, we've concentrated so much on fuel and perhaps weather, but there are 5 sources of fire that go into fire. The influence of the terrain, we're just starting to look at a little more sophisticated. The environmental moisture and atmospheric stability, we're only just barely getting on the edge of it, but they're all important sources of energy that are captured by a fire. So in terms, if we break down the fire behaviour process, we don't understand a lot about ignition, we just assume we've got ignition. The combustion process is a lot about the chemical and physical process, about heat transfer process, moisture, the chemical composition and so on. So there's a lot we can do in the combustion to understand combustion. But I think we start to get a little more mileage out of things like what is causing the chain reaction to continue to propagate. So the rate at which a fire spread is really this chain reaction of ignition, just sequential ignitions going on. What is controlling that process? And where are the feedbacks coming into the system here? And then we can start to understand things like the effect of slope and interaction with the larger environment and so on. And we also need to understand, well, when does that all fall apart? When do we pass the threshold and fires actually go out, the natural extinction? That's really important for a lot of our environmental impacts because those unburnt patches actually add considerably to the heterogeneity and also affect our recovery times after fires. So I think we can predict fire spread adequately with the current models if we have the correct inputs. So, you know, we've come quite a long way and I would see Phoenix as having added a lot to that. Low intensity fire is much more problematic because we actually start to have resolution problems in the way we think. So the question is, are the connections the same at low intensity as they are at higher intensity? At higher intensity, it's actually easier because the connections are broader and a bit more gross. So this is a video from some work in the, and it works, video from some work in the United States where the US Forest Service, the Fire Lab, gone back to try to understand what makes a fire propagate. And what they've seen, and we sort of have always known, but hasn't been incorporated in models, is its convective effect that's really providing the main heat transfer process. So if we look at what's happening here, this is a uniform fuel bed. We've got horizontal vortices going on here. And where the vortices are coming down to the fuel level, that's where we're getting the main heat transfer, and that's where we're getting the most rapid fire advance. But where that rapid fire advance is occurring, it continues to move. So we think of it as a solid front moving forward, but it's not. In fact, it's a whole lot of fingers of where the hot air coming down to the ground is moving through the fuel bed, heating it to ignition point, and propagating. So flame contact is quite important in that because that's hot gases that are moving through, and you've got all the free radicals in the flaming zone. For years, we've thought and always run our models on radiation. Radiation is not that important. The connecting process is convection. And we can explain most of the behaviour of fire by convective activity. So they've gone back to the drawing board to better understand this process. I couldn't help but put a Phoenix thing in. So I guess Phoenix Rapid Fire, I think, is a good example of how we try to understand these relationships better. We don't necessarily understand all that well how the fuels distribute across the landscape or what the weather's like at local levels, but we know it well enough to be able to make the connections from a fire point of view. So what we've done in Phoenix is really made convection driving this process at a large level. It drives the spotting process, the heat transfer process. Phoenix is more about the connections and the processes than it is about what's happening at a very local level. And it's an empirical model in that we relate it to what we've actually have seen. This is not a real fire, by the way, if anyone lives in Hepburn Springs or Dalesford. But I'll show you where to light it if you don't. But what you can do once you start doing the simulation is you get very area-specific or point-specific sort of variation. So the different colours you see here mean it's been burnt differently. So it's one fire, but the landscape is being treated differently. And if we lit this fire 200 metres to one side, 10 minutes later, we'd get a different answer. It's part of that chaotic response that we get in a dynamic system where feedbacks are behaving. So there's the dynamic nature of this modelling process is really quite important. And if we can get the connections right, then we can go back and improve the nodes or the points that are driving the process. All right. And it's also a useful visualisation tool because it's so complex. We're much better with our brain visualising things than we are reading it out of a scientific paper or whatever. Visualisation is really a critical tool or a really powerful tool for doing this explanation. So I think we need to understand fire scale and behaviour much better than we do. The effects of spatial heterogeneity and behaviour on its ability to integrate other sources of energy. So we have practical things like working out bell assessments for people building in houses. What happens if you only got a 20-metre slope? There are some very real-life practical problems that we're dealing with. When will fires self-extinguish? Because we want to know about patches left in the landscape. When will they capture energy from other sources? How does the flammability affect the scale? Some of these things we're working on, but it's about how all of those interact and tie together is really quite important. From a fire ecology point of view, the evolution of the ecosystems. So we're interested in genetic transfer, we're interested in responses to climate and edaphic change. The interactions between organisms and parts, competition, habitat dispersal, they're all important, and processes in terms of life cycle growth, nutrient cycling and so on. So where do I think we need to go? Well, I think the resilience concept is a really critical pin in all of this. Polling in 1973 started talking about ecosystem resilience, and basically what he said was an equilibrium-centred view is essentially static and provides little insight into the transient behaviour of ecosystems, let's call them, that aren't near equilibrium. So natural, undisturbed systems are likely to continually be in a transient state. So why do we try to map them as being in a sort of some fixed state? Then Holling with some other colleagues went on to talk about ecosystem resilience as being the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganise while undergoing change, so still to retain essentially the same function, structure, identity and feedbacks, the same emergent behaviour. So it's still basically operating in the same way, but it may look different. I suppose you could look at a classroom of students and say, okay, well, they're behaving like students. They're wearing thongs and they're living poorly and they rock up late and they go to sleep during lectures. But you could basically replace, say, that 50 group, those 50 students with another group of 50 students, and you get the same emergent behaviour. They're still going to sleep, they're still wearing thongs, still not eating very good meals. But so it's not so important about who those 50 people are, it's more about their behavioural pattern and the way they interact. Got any students? Oh, I've got a few students, that's right. So ecosystem resilience, I think, is a really key linking feature here. And we're talking about landscape resilience, but it's connectedness across the landscape in terms of the genetic connections, the habitat connections, fire connections. So I guess one of the things that I've found with the application of a process of using the vital attributes of plants and animals to understand the distribution of the process of doing prescribed burning and managing a landscape, I originally came up with a list of 17 steps to go through, and I don't want you to read these 17 steps, but basically we can do a lot of that almost automatically on GIS with certain tools. But what we miss out on is some of these things down here, which is going out into the landscape and actually seeing whether the state is the way we expected it to be from our prediction. How is that, because of all the other interacting complex factors, how is that all behaving? How has the fire actually impacted on that area? Have we looked at that specific site and got immediate feedback? I don't think we're doing very well down this end where it's sort of dealing with that more complex interactive component of it. We've nailed this bit here by all our mapping and our GIS tools and so on, but we're missing the complexity of the system. And that comes back to the experience and the skill and capability of people involved in it. Fire and culture. Fire is important for lifestyle, for customs, beliefs and spirituality. Fire plays a big role in our life. We all love to stand around a bonfire. It brings people together. You notice even down here in AVG, there's a fire pit, not that it gets used that often, but people love standing around a fire or a campfire, brings people together and allows them to talk and share experiences. The Aboriginal people used to have corroborees, and fire was a central part of that, allowed them to meet their neighbouring crews, do a bit of genetic exchange and to swap stories. And I guess, I'm not saying CFA has genetic exchange as part of the CFA. The same thing, a lot of people are in the CFA not to fight fires, it's really to be part of a community organisation. It's basically to feel some sort of friendship and membership. Firefighting's part of it, but a lot of the membership and being part of the group is much more than that. And the Royal Commission recognised that CFA should primarily be a community-based organisation. And to me, that message hasn't really got through terribly well. It's not a paramilitary organisation. Some cultures have used fire. This is Viking funeral pyre, so cremation. I'll put this in for Leon. I thought Leon loves the dead bodies and things. But no one said I was wrong, that's good. So part of this is sort of to gasify the body, if you like, and turn it into the heavens, to put it into another universe. But there's also a practical reason. People who have died of disease or maybe become disease after they die, it's a good way of actually sterilising the system as well. So it has a practical side to it, but also has a spiritual and religious sort of aspect to it. In many religions, they use candles for sort of seeing a light, a way forward, a connection to another spiritual world. Fire is a really powerful symbol in many cultures. The Asians often burn things like money, although this is hell money, so it's artificial money, to try and get on the good side of their relations who have died or whatever, making offerings. Not that the burnt money is going to be much good to them, but hopefully they then get some favours back. They sort of see fire as a connecting between the here and the afterlife. So I think we need to look at what places like the CFA, RFS and CFS, all these volunteer organisations are really there for. What's really the binding purpose of those? And I'd say it's not to run a paramilitary organisation. We're removing campfires and bush barbecues because they're an ignition source and so on, but there's a cost to that, I reckon. So it's all very well having a gas barbecue plugged into your mains gas in the back of your house, but actually sitting around a fire has another aspect to it altogether. So we need to think about some of the things we're doing. And Rosemary and I have been travelling a little bit. There are some campsites that make a thing about allowing you to have fires, and people love that idea of being able to sit out at night and sit around a fire. And there's a spiritual aspect to it, it's not just physical. So it's about all these interacting factors. And finally, the governance side of things, policy, planning, legislation, funding. I think the community engagement is a really important way of binding together. So the inform, consult, engage, collaborate, empower, they're really good concepts, and it takes a lot of work to get through those, but that's really a strong way to go. The public benevolence, I think, is a bit of a problem. So I think we've got an enigma here. So we've got the public wants autonomy, that is the rights to do what they'd like, but they don't really want the responsibility. So the public wants the government to take the responsibility, and the government is usually more than happy to take control because it wants to see as though it's all powerful and it's in control. But that actually then compromises the ability for the community to take control and responsibility. So until we sort that out, until governments get a bit smarter about what they really want the community to do, they need to think more strongly about what role they play in trying to get the rights and responsibilities sorted. I think we made a major step forward, and the champion of this is sitting in the room here, but Liam had a big hand in putting this together. This is pointing in the right direction. This has got some long-term vision and allows us to actually move forward. It's not about suppressing fires, not about controlling fires. It's living with fire and what all that entails. There are some practical sides to that, of course, but there's a bigger picture to it that this document tries to encapsulate. And I think, you know, we're starting to go down the right sort of direction with some of these sort of documents. I have a little business that I call Tolhurst Bushfire Services, and this is a little logo I made up. You can see I'm not a graphic artist, but living in harmony with fire, I think, is such a strong direction we need to go. So I think there's a role for government, local government, insurance agencies to assess, highlight and communicate individual property risks annually. They've got the technical skills to do it. They need to pass that information on. They need to do it and then pass that information on to the people who don't have the technical skills but should have the rights and responsibilities to deal with it. But it needs to be put in their face and made easy to access. So here's a role that could easily be transferred. So again, trying to bind all those things together. So it's the ideal world's not just about getting all these balanced right, but it's also up the top line there, you see it's not just about the people, it's also about the environment. So the natural environment, the built environment, and climate and so on. So that should be our goal. So I think the Triple Helix is a really useful concept to deal with this. I think the science and technology is tending to outgrow the application, the experience and monitoring and review side of things. We need to keep these in balance and tightly connected. So I think from our point of view, it's an issue for experience transfer, both within peers, but also up and down through the community. How we recruit people, what sort of environmental skills, what sort of knowledge they've got is important, and how long they're sort of allowed to build experience in a particular location. So long-term employment is, has an important role here. So looking at the economic side of employment, we've lost sight of really what the outcomes, the best outcomes are. It's not necessarily the best long-term investment. And I think people need to be involved in fire and environment and so on, need to be learning the country. This is what the Aboriginal sort of term, the Aboriginal people need. We need to actually get used to seeing it in different seasons under different environments. Andy Ackland here has sorry, not only Andy. Andy plays around with fire in his backyard, and he's learnt an enormous amount by these little fires that he's had in the backyard, and he sees how it responds, and yet he hasn't been kicked out, and I don't think the CFO rocked up to his door for an unnotified vote. What's that? So it's about learning the country. You actually need to be out there and poking and prodding a bit to actually see what sort of reaction you get, and that needs to be valued. It may not have a piece of paper that goes with it, but that's experience and understanding. And I guess some of this adaptation conflicts with change management, so there's some philosophical decisions need to be made at the high level. So I think the Triple Helix is a way, you know, we need to tie all of this together, so the rope. So I guess our future is Rosemary standing up on top of St Mary's Peak in the Wilpena Pound and down at Arkaroola sort of camping. I guess we're going to try and get a bit more in touch with the land in coming years by taking a little AVAN out to the wilderness. But I think there's a lot that the university ought to be looking at. I think it's a lot the land management agencies ought to be looking at as to whether they're really heading in the right direction. There are some good signs, but it's not going to happen by accident. So I hope you can take away the chain and the rope analogy as something that fits into your thinking, but we're working in complex systems, whether it's the natural environment, whether it's fire, whether it's people, communities, they're all complex systems. We need to actually not try to simplify it down to this reductionist approach, because we'll never be able to make the links again. So anyway, that's my ramble. It was the longest lecture I guess I've given, but thank you for your persistence, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kevin. That was wonderful. So it probably was one of the most insightful and enlightening presentations we had in years, and are very, very grateful for that. For those of you who don't know, and I don't think there's anyone about in the room that doesn't know, Kevin actually doesn't work for us anymore. He had his last day last week, Friday. So you all were witnesses of Kevin's first honorary or maybe even consulting job in the post-retirement era. And you saw it, so you got a little plug-in for his small business, Tolhurst Consulting. There are many more, of course, but there's many copies, but only one original. For those of you who don't know, who are not regularly here, this seminar was done as a webinar, so we have colleagues and friends listening online, and therefore now in question time we have to pass around the microphone, and I have an assistant too, so there's Trent over there who will run around with a microphone, and I'm sure Kevin will be very happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's a really great presentation. Just interested in your thoughts on that field component, the skill and the capability around, especially the field component, and especially the actual application of fire and all the technical skills around applying fire through burning and suppression. You got some views on some ways forward for that? Is it through the education at the uni, or is it through the agencies, or a mixture of all of that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a mixture. So I've been surprised, I guess, at times at various inquiries and so on, when someone gets up and gives evidence. I've got 40 years experience in firefighting, and this is what I saw and this is how I interpret it. And you think as they're talking, they've learnt very little in that 40 years about the fires and what really connections are made there. They can repeat some of the parts history. And then on the other hand, you might have someone who's been highly educated and knows a lot of the theory, but hasn't got a lot of experience to add together. So I really think it's a matter of interchanging the life experience as well as the education. So the two have to go together so that you get the understanding as well as the knowledge. So the education, I think, can provide those links. And to me, the best education is not a training, which tends to be a bit more systematic and doing by numbers, but an education where your understanding allows you to grow as the world changes around you and you move into different environments. You, again, can reinterpret that environment and what you're seeing. So to me, that's what a university education is about, is basically giving you that flexibility to be able to quickly analyse and make sense of this new environment. So I think it's a combination of both, and someone who has a lot of experience doesn't necessarily know a lot, and someone who's just had an academic education may not actually know a lot either. So I think it's really the combination of the two. Part of the, I think there's a lot to be shared after events that people can use as well, and I think that ought to be considered a legitimate use of people's time. So perhaps visiting an area that's been burnt with, say, a dozen colleagues to talk about what's going on, I think that's a legitimate sort of thing too. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, and congratulations on a fantastic career. I mean, for a lot of us, you really represent the epitome of how you engage with practitioners and with the community more broadly. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Rod.
Max Planck said that science advances one funeral at a time.
Thanks, Rod.
So what are the concepts that are holding bushfire science back now, and how do we get past them?
I think, to me, the last little bit I had there about community taking more responsibility as well as having the rights. If the community becomes better educated and understands fire better, that makes it easier for governments. It makes it easier for the land managers to actually implement their their policies, which they know from experience and from research, is a useful way to go. So I think it's getting the community on board. If we just say, we know what to do, just trust us, I think that's doomed to failure. So that's why I think that the Triple Helix thing within the university is really important. It needs to allow academics and researchers to be able to actually legitimately spend time with community members providing that exchange, and that needs to be acknowledged and rewarded in its own right. So it's not just about having publications on a shelf, it's also about how well that's been transferred to the community. And the Triple Helix is aiming towards that, but it's just so hard to quantify it. We keep falling back to publications, but I think that's what we've got to keep pushing. That would be my summary.
Yes, well done. Just a couple of points. The fire, as you said, the fire changes the landscape, and the Grampians, I suppose, is a classic example of a herb-rich woodland to a forest to now a scrubland. So, and next question is, where will it go from there? So that's the thing we need to look at in the future. A couple of other points is that the people in charge now have got a policy of, well, the policy that is in place encourages bigger and bigger fires. So we're getting less and less burning throughout the landscape. And the big one for that is the community involved in that burning. There's this huge, I'd say, media phobia on fire. So we discourage people from actually doing burns in their backyards, doing controlled burns of any description. We have a huge window of opportunity over summer to burn, especially with 5-7 day forecasts. We know when the weather's going to be bad. Why can't we actually burn in that better time rather than having this fire restriction period, so that we can't actually do the best burning? So I suppose in the big picture is that we sort of need to educate people that there's going to be massive wildfires, and the worst case scenario is this runaway policy by the CFA. So are we just going to run away from the whole?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but there's a number of things in what you've said which are quite valid. I think the idea that the community has to take more responsibility and for fire is an important one, but that's not just going to happen. You don't just hand that over. I once learned at a management meeting that delegation isn't just fobbing off the things you don't want to do to someone else. You actually have to provide certain powers and responsibilities and rewards for that extra responsibility you're handing over. So I think that relationship has to build up. Now, I remember being stunned once, being accused of being a forester and not being able to communicate very well. So we don't need people like foresters. They didn't say like me, but the sort of, that's why I took it, because they can't communicate properly. And this was about 30 years ago. We need people who are better communicators. So I think what we have now is a lot of people can write lots of plans and policies and so on, but they don't actually understand the land as well as perhaps a lot of the people who are more connected to the land were. And we need the mix of both. It's not one or the other. It's actually the mix of the two. And it's probably true a lot of foresters perhaps weren't all that articulate and didn't communicate very well because that wasn't their main interest. Their main interest was working out in the forest. So there needs to be a culture change, but that needs to come from above. And at the moment, I believe, and it's a bit political, I suppose, but a lot of government agencies are being driven by government policy and government, what is in the best interest of government, not necessarily what's in the best interest of the environment or the community at large. You know, there's a shorter term horizon. So that's just something you have to work with. But you need to turn the ship slowly, I think. And the more power you can give to the community, the better. And as I was trying to say before, by having field days so that people understand what's happening up in the Grampians, what the options are and so on, they can become another voice. It's not just your voice anymore. You've empowered other people to be able to have an informed voice as well. And that's a gradual process. But the people doing the research, the people doing the teaching need to be more broadly engaged. And that has to be time has to be given for that. And likewise, people in government agencies need to be given the time to be able to spend time with community members and so on. But it needs to be done in a reasonably organised way, so it actually builds on itself and doesn't just dissipate and doesn't achieve anything. Is there anything online?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, Kevin. And does that work?
Yep.
And yeah, it's your contributions over your career. It's fantastic. Look, I wondered if whether you'd prepared to comment on the role and value of royal commissions in terms of achieving the aspirations that you have expressed. I noticed that you made strong reference to Stretton, for example, but and it may have been deliberate or not that you didn't make a lot of reference to some of the more recent inquiries. And I'm referring in particular to the process of inquiry itself, the way they're set up and the way that views are expressed. For example, it seems to me that in some cases the individuals who have the expertise aren't necessarily the ones who are on the stand. And in relation to organisations, for example, corporate views are expressed and often via the lawyers rather than the professionals. And I wonder the extent to which that contributes to the sort of thing that you referred to, that some of the people who get up don't necessarily have the expertise. They may have views of service, etc. So, comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think things like Royal Commission inquiries are very valuable tools, and a lot has come out of it. The reason why I didn't go beyond Stretton, because most of Stretton's recommendations were repeated again in the 2009 Royal Commission. In a way, a lot of things are still common, but what has inquiries like that, coronial inquiries and Royal Commissions, should be much more inquisitorial in the sense of just trying to get the real facts and the real information. And it's absolutely stunning how much information comes out through that process that wasn't known at the time. Well, was known in quite a dispersed way, but was all then brought together and you start to build up a picture. So I think they play a really important role in building that full picture. But unfortunately, they've become almost processes where people are looking for the outcomes to then follow up with sort of legal to go and sue and sort of they rather than being inquisitorial, they're actually really trying to look for blame and costs and so on, and that destroys the benefit, I reckon, largely of those systems. So I think they're good, and because of that, you then have the wrong people in the stand, because you don't want someone saying something that's against the best interest of an organisation or the government or whatever. And even some of the people who are in the know, they'll be advised by their legal people as to the way in which they should answer questions and so on, and that can be quite distorting as well. It's not that it's untrue, it's just distorting. And it's because of the potential for litigation and blame afterwards. So the system is okay, but it's been corrupted, I think, by this accountability issue. And that's one of the things the government needs to fix, in a sense, is we need to put the responsibility back on the individuals rather than expect that the government or some large corporation is going to actually give you some sort of monetary handout as a result of the fire. One of the things I like about, I did some work in South Africa at one stage, and they, in their laws, people had to put in fire breaks. This is in sort of a cropping, grazing type country. And if a fire exited your property and burnt your neighbours, you were responsible for what was burnt on your neighbour. And that was a serial responsibility. So if 5 people got burnt out, there were effectively 4 people responsible for their neighbour's loss. It didn't all go back to where the fire originated. So you should have had the capability of stopping the fire on your property if you had sufficient fire breaks and firefighting equipment. I quite like that idea, rather than saying it all belongs to the power company where the power line was. Well, you know, they maintain it to a level that they can afford, given the fees they write. They could have a perfect system, but no one could afford to use it. So, you know, I think the government can sort a lot of that out and provide us a better environment to work within. So it's the environment they're working in that's the problem, rather than some of the instrumentalities or some of the tools within it.
in the interest of time, we have to leave it at that. So let's put our hand together once more for Kevin Tolhurst.